Hello and welcome to another chain-rattling and gas-blasting episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that goes to hell and back to unearth the craziest development stories of the entertainment industry. And while we wait for the next cinematic appearance of good old Al Simmons, which at this rate might be by the time our grandchildren are old enough to see it, why don't we delve into the first attempt to turn what was at one point the hottest comic property in the world into a major motion picture. See, in the early 90s, fledgling comic book company Image was all the rage, with Spawn, Savage Dragon, and yes, even X-Force, I mean Youngblood, flying off the shelves. But many of these properties didn't translate to other mediums over all that well when compared to the likes of, say, Batman or the X-Men. But you can't deny the guilty pleasure of the Wildcats theme song. We got invincible powers! Anyway, with all that said, since we're now torso deep into October, I think it's about time to answer the question, what happened to 1997's Spawn?
You got that I want to beat the fat little man look in your eye.
Creator of Netcrid, Todd McFarlane, knew he had to capitalize on the popularity of another one of his creations, that being the hellbound hero that is Spawn, a lover of Wanda's and former CIA operative turned undead warrior who used his mystical powers and sometimes lots of guns to dispense vicious justice to anyone who pissed him off. To get Spawn over with the mainstream audience, Todd pulled out all the stops, splintering off the property into a hyper-detailed action figure line, various video game projects, and an envelope-pushing animated TV show. But the crown jewel, of course, was for Spawn to explode onto the silver screen. And while McFarlane had complete control over the action figures, since he established his own company in which to do so, and HBO gave him a lot of creative freedom and spooky dungeon sets on the cartoon series, he had decidedly less pull in Hollywood. So the road to a Spawn feature film getting greenlit was much less of a straightforward one. It was around 1992, shortly after the first issue of the comic book sold 1 million copies, where Columbia Pictures inquired Mr. McFarlane about the movie rights and if they were perchance purchasable, to which good old Todd proudly proclaimed no, and to get the hell out of his office. Since Image Comics were run by the creators of the characters themselves, that meant Todd held all the cards, and there was one aspect to Columbia's offer he really couldn't abide by, and that was the aforementioned creative input. Columbia simply wouldn't give it to him, and thus he needed to find someone who would, which again wasn't the easiest thing in the world, as getting that type of access was pretty rare in the industry back then, and today as well, depressingly enough. So perhaps recalling back to the 80s when one small movie studio took a chance on a fedoraed slasher villain attacking teens in their dreams, Todd McFarlane had a meeting with New Line Cinema, who were just coming off back-to-back successes with another comic book property, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Todd, ever the businessman, said he would hand over the movie rights to New Line for the rather insane sum of $1 American, which meant he had to have at least a few caveats billowing within his own mysterious gnarled cape. One of these caveats, as it turned out, was the creative input on the product. The script, the casting, pretty much everything outside the actual directing of it. The other asterisk Todd lobbied for that was even smarter was the merchandising rights, which included those ultra-detailed action figures. The nature of business, however, is built on a lot of give and take, and thus New Line laid down their one mandate, which was if Spawn was to be successful in theaters, the only place they were expected to make money, it had to appeal to the broadest audience possible, so I think you know where I'm going with this. Spawn, the story of a trigger-happy CIA hitman who gets double-crossed, burned to death, sent to hell, and resurrected with the intention of leading a demonic army against heaven, was going to be PG-13, whether Todd wanted it or not. I've covered enough stories in the past to know when a violent property is changed to be suddenly less violent, it tends to lose a bit of its luster, its edge, if you will, to hardcore fans. You know, the ones that would actually pay to see a movie based on said property. In Spawn's case, the original comic book was more or less PG-13 as well. The naughtiest swear words were censored, nudity mostly non-existent, and blood and/or guts were implied rather than outright shown, although Todd found some creative ways around this. Movie making, however, is an entirely different beast, as the MPAA were getting increasingly strict ever since the late 80s and well into the 90s, as just one errant blood spray or innocent swear word would often slap a film with an R rating faster than you could blink. However, I guess since Todd had experience depicting violent scenes under restrictions before and of course got everything else he wanted in the deal, I'm sure he figured it wouldn't be that big of an issue. To ensure a relatively consistent level of quality between all the in-development Spawn products, Alan McElroy, who was working on the scripts for the animated series, was also tasked with the motion picture, which, made sense considering how well received the mature-rated HBO show had turned out to be. However, Mr. McElroy has had a spotty writing history before and after Spawn, as he was responsible for Halloween 4, Rapid Fire, the Sega CD FMV game Ground Zero Texas, and finally Ballistic X vs. Sever, which is painfully on brand for this show. Obviously, though, a writer is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to box office bombs, and really, it took for a variety of pieces all working together to earn Spawn its less than sterling reputation. Regardless, with the deal set, a writer working on the script, and a tentative $20 million budget allocated for principal photography, special effects would be the next thing that had to be worked out, as it would play a massive part in the project, and it's also here where a series of coincidental connections will result in the last of Hell's soldiers falling into place. Industrial Light and Magic were chosen to helm the effects of Spawn, and they were on quite the hot streak in the early 90s. Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, Twister, and 1994's The Mask being of particular note here. Todd was having a discussion with Clint Goldman, who had been the FX producer on The Mask, and after hearing everything they were planning and realizing just how complicated the many effects, creatures, and sequences were going to be, it spurred Goldman to swing for the fences and to raise his own Hollywood standing in the process. Since he and fellow ILM employee Mark DePay had a ton of experience with CGI, he asked Todd if he could step in as another producer, with Mark sitting in the director's chair, which would give the project a solid technology-heavy edge. Todd was enthusiastic about this, and so they were added to the kitchen, which is rapidly filling with chefs. And what's more, and maybe a bit more important, Mark DePay had never directed a live-action film before, with only one music video as his sole directing credit. So you see what I mean now before about how multiple pieces needed to come together to equal a flop? Well, here you have a PG-13 restriction, an ambitious script, multiple producers, a tight budget, and an inexperienced director on top of it. So it's no wonder we're talking about it all now. Mark DePay would later comment on the speed on how the whole deal had come together in the Spawn DVD audio group commentary. It was an insane first movie for us to make. Here we are, first-time filmmakers, and we're given $40 million. It was stupid. It's embarrassing. Fortunately, the casting process went a good deal better. Martial artist Michael Jai White was immediately drawn to the character and brought a sense of physicality and intensity to the role of Al Simmons, while John Leguizamo, despite being hampered by an 8-hour makeup process and a 40-pound suit, was a natural at getting across clown/violators' disturbing and sometimes irritating demeanor. Then there was the main villain, so to speak. Technically, there's 3 stuffed into the story, with one played by Martin Sheen, who is definitely acting against type, as he hammed it up as Jason Wynn, complete with a 100% authentic-looking dye job. During filming, Todd, Clint, and Mark started to realize that the special effects budget was going to balloon as more and more shots were needed, as initially they tried to replicate Spawn's iconic cape with physical props, having off-camera stagehands moving it around at all times, but this was deemed quite horrendous looking and not very practical. So it was decided that the cape should be switched to all digital, which, I guess was the better option somehow? As more and more logistical problems started to crop up, the crew knew things were perhaps not going as well as planned, and were worried about the final sequence that was set to take place in Hell, as it really needed to wow fans and send them home happy. The reason they were worried was because in the original script, the underworld was set to merely look like a pitch black room, as there simply wasn't any budget or good visual way to represent Hell on screen with physical sets. That's when the crew decided they needed to make a plea to New Line higher-ups to allow them to create Hell entirely with CGI as a giant set piece. This would certainly put them even more over budget, so to save money elsewhere, Clint Goldman offered that if they could cut 7 full days of shooting out of the schedule by putting in more hours elsewhere, reusing sets, etc., if they could then allocate that budget to make a fiery computer-generated hellscape, to which New Line cautiously agreed to. It's up to the viewer if that money was well spent. But even as a 15-year-old watching that PS1 cutscene back then, and previously having my mind blown by the likes of Jurassic Park and The Mask, I can confidently say, it was not worth it. With filming now completed, the arduous task of post-production was next on the hit list. The original plan was for 100 special effects shots, which by the time the cameras had stopped rolling, this number had swelled to over 400. That's like Lord of the Rings levels of miscalculation. So many shots had to be rushed through post-production because ILM was very much in demand at the time, with bigger movies taking their priorities. Then came the actual editing, and along with it, the MPAA. They were absolutely vicious and simultaneously vague on what was appropriate for a PG-13 rating, with Mark DePay saying to Philly.com back in 1997, "We had to deal with very arcane and cloaked arguments over what's acceptable for kids. It upsets me because the boundaries float very conveniently depending on who the parties involved are and the way the winds in this country blow. Everyone knows certain stars make films for kids, so it's okay for them to make a film where people die, get their heads ripped off, whatever. But we make a film about a man who goes to hell and we can't show any blood. We can't even say the word hell." As for that last point, yeah, that was also backed up by Clint Goldman in that same interview, adding, "The MPAA would never tell us what scene or aspect of the film was too violent or extreme. They simply said the overall movie merits an R rating. Therefore, as filmmakers, we had to decide what limitations to impose on our movie, and one of those limitations was not to say hell. That's just the way it is. You can't fight City Hall." This resulted in Spawn having tons of instances of just awkward dialogue where given the situation and the tone of the film, that Spawn or Clown would and or should be swearing up a storm in that particular scene, but they had to get around it with insults you'd more likely hear on your local kindergarten playground.
"You filthy little piece of vermin.
You food-sucking dipstick."
All of this produced an end product that tonally was all over the place, something both fans and critics picked up on, as Spawn was absolutely burned in critical reviews of the day, and saw a less than stellar box office haul. It barely made $80 million worldwide, which was far behind the likes of other comic book fare like Batman Forever or The Mask, but it at least outdrew The Phantom, I guess? Michael Jai White was even critical of the finished film, saying bluntly to The Hollywood Reporter in 2018, "There is no footage of me ever saying that I liked Spawn. I have never said that I thought that was a good movie." And while Mr. White, Mr. Leguizamo, and even New Line continued to make big movies for years, Mark Tappei, sadly, was the odd one out. He wouldn't direct another film until 2004's, This Thing, followed by a bunch of animated straight-to-DVD Garfield features and then some CGI Marmaduke trash fire that I didn't even know existed until just now. As for Spawny himself, well, I don't think much else needs to be said. Mr. McFarlane has been trying to get a new movie project off the ground for the last 9 years, with the latest update being from this past February, where he helpfully explained, I'll just read this as written, "I'm hoping that the next piece of news will be, we've made the deal, right? And then that will be, I don't know. We're all moving towards that direction, but it's just time to just go, I'll talk to you when I've got something. Literally, when I have a bird in my hand and I can give you something concrete, instead of going, hey, we added," because we can add actors and we can add producers and we can add a director. It doesn't get us to the sale and into production. Thanks for the update, Todd. So if you're aware of any other hellish development life cycles in the video game or movie industries, if you or you know anyone that worked on Spawn the Eternal, please identify yourself. Let me know in the comments below or enter the dark alleyways of my social media. See you next time, Spawnies, and thanks for watching.